Well, good morning, everybody. It's an absolute surprise to see so many people making it to a Thursday morning after a big party night. Thank you very much. We've got a panel here this morning, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the impact of open source on the industry. Now, those of you who've been in enterprise IT have been buying co-source or commercial software for the last, well, forever. Really, we haven't had much of a choice. And in the last just 5 years, I think, we've started to see that open source is changing things up. Docker, Linux, the idea of Red Hat providing us with commercial support. And the idea was that what we wanted to do is talk a little bit about how open source is changing the shape of IT and how it's changing the IT equation that we have. So 30 years ago, Interop got a bit of a start as an interoperability test lab between competing network products, and Linux was years away from where we were. And today, the concepts of open and interoperable are complex and extend far more than just between two Ethernet switches or vendors' OSPF routing protocols. It's now about how do various Linux apps actually integrate with the network. So implementing open source technologies can be challenging, and organizations must prepare themselves for the potential risks. It's not easy deploying open source. So I've got a team of people here. Let's ask some questions. Thanks, Jono, Colin, and Sean for coming today. Yep. So open source projects are destroying corporate value. We've got all of these corporate companies out there who've been producing commercial products and selling them to us for fortunes. And now open source projects come along and then suddenly are giving them away for free. Today's dominant players, like Microsoft and Oracle, are suddenly competing against open source projects which are effectively free. So the question is, let's start with you, Jono.
Okay.
How much damage has been done to corporate businesses, and can they survive the open source trend?
I don't think there is that much damage being done to businesses. I think the landscape has changed. And like anything in technology, if you don't keep up, then you're going to become irrelevant. And open source has become the new way in which businesses can drive value in terms of how they can consume technology. And then, of course, when they want to add their pieces on, like the Linux Foundation often talk about, 70% of what you need to build you can find with existing open source components, and then you build the bits on top of that.
Sure.
And that's revolutionized how technology works. So I don't think it's so much destroying value, but it's changing the shape of how it works, and it's bringing in a set of norms and questions that are very uncomfortable in traditional enterprise environments.
Yeah, and I think to expand on this, I agree with your perspective. If you look at what's happened in the past, we used to go to these large conferences and look to the large technology vendors, say, "Oh, Mr. Chambers, what router did you bring to me today?" Right? And then we looked at the integrators and the resellers because they controlled information. And then as customers and operators, we were really dependent on these sets of people for them to innovate.
To impart the secrets of knowledge.
Absolutely. And what's happened, and started with the large operators and the large telco providers as well. But with open source, the area of invention has changed, right? And this does affect how the way that corporations play. Operators and individuals are now innovating. It's leveled the playing field, innovating in the same way as the Ciscos, the Junipers, the Aristas in the world. And recently what's been happening, what I've seen happening, is it used to be that in the open source side, we would commoditize things that the large vendors were making. Now what's happening, and we're seeing this in the OpenStack community, we're seeing this in the Docker community, we're seeing these communities all around the open source, is that innovation is actually happening in open source, and the corporations are packaging, consuming, and providing supportable methods for people.
It's a complete turnaround. They used to develop a product, and then for years it would cycle up. It would float from small to medium to large. Mm-hmm. And now open source is used by the largest companies, and it's actually cascading down the stack. So we see the FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, consume open source, and then that starts to trickle down into the bigger enterprises, and then down to the medium, and then slowly down into the SME. That's a real turn up in terms of business models, where years ago it took 15 years for a company to start out small and grow large. Yeah. Turns everything on its head. Your thoughts?
Yeah. So I would just kind of add that it's creative destruction. There's destruction happening, but everyone's jobs are changing. Everything's changing faster. Things like OpenStack are making commercial open source part of a company, actually changing companies from within. So just to reiterate what you guys are saying, it's happening a lot faster, and companies need to adapt, both as vendors and consumers. And now we see each other as partners, not as consuming what a vendor is giving us. We're looking more at how can we partner up on collaborative projects.
I actually see to me, open source is there's a shared base of common functions. And instead of each vendor reinventing the wheel, You know, every vendor making their own tires for their car, they just keep using each other's tires. And the value is actually inside the car, not the actual commodity functions outside of it.
I would say as well, there is at least from my perspective, there is a big misconception that the most valuable thing in open source is the code.
Yeah.
And I actually don't think that's the case. The code is the artifact. The most valuable thing is the process and the community that you're building around it. So we see this in two separate areas. You know, a good example is OpenStack, right? OpenStack has built this thriving community that really kind of innovated in the area of bringing businesses together to build interesting things and built that community. The code is it's interesting, it's relevant, it gets people into the game. And what we're seeing more and more now is bringing those principles into companies and inner sourcing. Again, the community, the process, the methodology, I think, is by far the most valuable thing. The code is very much secondary.
You know, it's really interesting to talk about the process of implementing the methodologies, the organizational structures for globally distributed agile software development teams.
Right.
Creating cloud and SDN platforms. This is a lot of what open source is about right now. I was literally in a meeting yesterday with the group CIO at Dimension Data, the company that acquired the company I work for, right? And about just that, about implementing the OpenStack big tent model across 30,000 employees in 54 countries. Open source absolutely changing more than the code we use. It is changing how we operate our companies, how we manage our teams.
Breaks down the cylinders of excellence.
Yeah,
we'll pretend that didn't happen.
The old idea that you are one thing. You know, you play fullback on the soccer team, or you're the front row of the rugby team, right?
It's football.
And now all of a sudden, sports ball.
It's football. Football.
Which one, round
Football.
or curved?
Soccer, football. Let's not perpetuate this myth that American football is
I was just making noises. I have no idea. Right? The thing is that when I was at school, you had to play one position in a team. You know, you were either this position or this position. And we took that to IT, and we said, okay, well, you're the networking guy, you're the storage guy, you're the compute guy. But the reality is that now we actually have teams where everybody needs to play every position, and we learned that from open source. Because in open source, if you're the best person for that code, you write it, and then you move over here and you write it for another one. And I think there's some the disruption to the corporate structure, you know, you boss, you worker, you know, and all of a sudden it's a much more fluid environment, much more changeable, much more fungible.
I was just going to say, I would add on top of that, you know, there's this kind of, I don't even want to know what the right word is. There's this approach, there's this spirit in software that if you're trying to contort software into something that doesn't feel natural, you're probably doing it wrong. Like if you're trying to use an API in a way that you've got to kludge around it, you're probably using it wrong. I'd also say that one of the great things about open source is that it challenges fundamental cultural elements of companies that shouldn't exist. You know, anyone who works for a large company has got a litany of things they can complain about in terms of process and bureaucracy. Open source has fundamentally challenged that. So it's actually been, I think, a really useful forcing function in getting companies to become more agile in different ways.
Let's talk about standards. So we've always relied, and the history of Interop over the last 30 years has been, and the Interop net was proving out interoperability. And we've relied on traditional standards bodies like the IEEE, the IETF, and so forth, to give us the defined standards. But more recently, we've seen the Linux foundations emerge, and they're creating the standards by de facto, by just implementing them, right? So instead of standards bodies producing the future, and we wait patiently for the tablets of stone to come down on the mountain with the final implementation, the Linux people or the open source people are just out there writing the code and shipping it, and then we have the standards coming after. So the question is open source standards or open source development replacing the standards bodies? Are we killing them?
I can lead off with that. So, I mean, if you look what IETF was in the past, it was the area for interoperability. I think a great topic for Interop became the area for politicking and large manufacturers exerting control and driving internet standards in a way that leverage their own inventions and their own intellectual property. There's been a pushback from that in the community, as there was this pushback in large operators, large telcos, and even small operators and telcos. You know, it's something that isn't confined to the large, that is really confined to talent. But OpenStack I use as a great example. Open vSwitch is kind of an okay example. Actually, I use Open vSwitch as an example. So if you look at OVSDB, Open vSwitch Database Protocol, inside of IETF, it is a standard. It's defined as an RPC mechanism, and it says reference. The OVSDB schema is defined within Open vSwitch. And so where the standard for integrating SDN controllers and open forwarding planes is done in an open source project. And the good and bad of that is the pace of innovation and accelerated innovation happens every day in that space. on the bad side of that, and like my teams, we do multi-platform SDN integrations and SDN development, both in open and closed source every day. It is near impossible to code to a standard when it moves that fast, and when there's the vendor politics and the personal politics.
The two sides of that is that open standards took time, there was consensus, we achieved consensus, and when we finally got there, this was the best that we could do. In open source, firing off like a shotgun in 50 different directions, we have fragmentation, and we may not necessarily have convergence or something that we can actually consume.
Well,
so I would add that the speed in which open source is moving right now is a lot faster than what a lot of companies and a lot of groups expect and can handle. But that is only generally true if they're not actually involved, if they're not contributing in some way. At least participating by witnessing the meetings and actually participating.
So you're saying a way to handle that is to get involved in the mailing lists and go to the meetups and
at least
and track how that's actually working out.
If you don't participate, then you're left out, and you wait 6 months for and treat open source like a vendor and what it's going to spit out in 6 months. It's going to be so different to what you expect that it's going to take you a little bit to spin up and understand what it is.
Well, even past that, I absolutely agree with you that participating in the blueprinting process is so important, participating in the overall design process and actively participating in the community. But what I've also seen is the vendors, the challenge that some of the vendors have is they're not running agile teams. They're running classical electrical engineering.
Yeah, cylinders of excellence, or what I call the military model.
They're spinning ASICs.
You work on,
Well, they're still spinning ASICs, right, functionally, even though they're writing code. And at the speed that community moves at, it's near impossible for them to actually integrate with it. If you're a customer or an operator or whatever, it is a lot easier as long as you form your teams around this model.
I think there is also some developer workflow that you can put in place to balance this out a little bit. So I think one of the first large open source projects that did this well was Debian, where they have a stable repo, they have a testing repo, they have an unstable repo. And what happens is, depending on your use of Debian, you can use it in different scenarios. So all the exciting, active new stuff that's going on is happening in unstable. If you're running a service that has to be online all the time, then you use stable. So I think you can, to Sean's point, you've got to be involved and you've got to be active.
The flip side is that that's not unique to open source, because we have the same engagement with commercial software and commercial products. We go and work with the vendor, we get heads up on what the pipelines look like, they tell us that.
Right.
You've just got to make sure that you don't expect open source to mystically address that problem. It's the same.
To a certain extent, though.
Yeah.
So I would say that one of the things that open source has a tendency, as most groups do, to be a little bit lax in the documentation and the training. So if you're not there participating and understanding it and maybe even advocating for better documentation and training, it's going to take you a little bit longer to spin back up, because that pre-sales organization that something like Cisco is so well known for, being able to get you up to speed fast just doesn't exist.
Or Oracle and its ability to bring a phenomenal amount of resources to bear, or SAP, same sort of thing.
Yeah,
although it comes with a hell of a price tag sometimes. But
the community is there to benefit itself, not to wait for some new participant. And once they show up, they're like, "Oh, we've been waiting for you. Here's all."
And the other thing
let's
encourage
participation.
participation.
Right? Let's talk then about corporate influence in open source projects. As anybody can participate in an open source project. Any of you, me, if you've got the time and the will, jump into an open source project and start participating. The challenge, of course, is that corporations who've got billions of dollars, lots of funds, can fund developers to go and work in these projects and take an open source project in a direction that might suit them. Now, that can be good or evil, of course, right? Open source started, and sometimes we have this real culture clash, because open source started as an act of political defiance. It was meant to be like, let's take back ownership of our IT and do what we want. And they tend to reject the corporate process. The flip side is, code is the coin of the realm. Corporations come along, bring in a team of tens of developers, all fully funded, no questions asked, and then all of a sudden you've got a culture clash that can become a problem. So, corporations embrace open source, they bring value, they bring skills, they bring, fingers on keyboards. But is it something that transcends the tribe, or is it something that can tear an open source project down?
I think it depends hugely on the individual companies, the individual projects. We often talk about open source as this kind of as if all open source projects are equal, and they're very different. I think a big chunk of this is companies who understand the principles of collaboration. The early companies that did very well, such as Red Hat, are a great example, $2 billion company. part of the reason why they've been so successful is they not only understood their audience and they understood the technology, but they really understood what goes into the heart of what makes people collaborate well. Companies that have done less well, that have failed, that have dipped their toes in and then pulled their toes right back out again, are because they've looked at it from a very specific perspective that serves the interest of that specific company. So once again, like in my mind, there is not a direct link between companies and open source that is negative. Most of the open source development done today is done by companies. But those companies have to know how to do it well. And that's not a technology thing. That's a people
And that's
thing.
not perfect either. It's not like they get it right. I've seen plenty of corporate companies say, we're going to do an open source project, and then,
Oh, yeah.
people
awful.
just stop.
It's awful.
Putting code out on GitHub does not mean open source.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
You mentioned, I think one thing you left out about what helps companies succeed in open source is the people. Right,
Totally.
and if you look at the people that I see in the community, and I think we know a lot of the same people, one of the things that I see happen very often is this concept I call badges away. It's something, when we were doing the OpenStack training stuff, which happened every day. There were competing companies that worked together, and you as individuals had agreed on a common goal to talk about, that original point of how companies, you identify your unique sauce, the things that differentiate you in the projects, and then you identify the shared things that help lift that up. And you just accept that, and who pays my paycheck?
Yes.
Who pays your paycheck? They may compete.
Yep.
But we need to work together in this common good to lift up both of our companies.
We need paychecks to make open source projects. It doesn't disappear just because we suddenly decided we'd make software that we'd give away for free. It still people have to eat and pay mortgages, right?
Right.
Well, what's refreshing out of this is to see, you see IETF, and there's a lot of collaboration in IETF, but there's a lot of politics and positioning and stalling.
Yep.
And there's some of that in open source projects, but specifically what I've seen in OpenStack has been an amazing amount of collaboration, personal relationships.
Let me ask you, you're highlighting the fact that open source culture, that everybody contributes to get an outcome. Is that open source attitude toxic to corporate cultures? So if I'm running an IT team and I've got all these people living in their cylinders of capability or their cylinders of excellence, and then all of a sudden they start working in an open source project and you can do anything, does that damage existing IT teams, or does it improve them in some way?
Well,
It's not toxic, it's disruptive.
It's disruptive. Very
annoying.
disruptive.
And also, I'd say doing open source well in the company is not you can go off and do whatever you want. It's like you've got this specific set of goals that we identify as important to our company and what we're doing,
Right.
and you will work on those.
you need to treat it like research and development, I would
Yep.
add. So that finer point gets lost on a lot of people. All companies in one form or another do some research and development. Maybe typically they do it in a back room, and the vendor would come in and give them some pre-look or maybe the first run of some new products, and they do some stuff to it and try to figure out if they can run it in production.
But it's shocking though, right? If you've got this organization and everybody's got a silo of functionality, and suddenly open source comes in and starts to disrupt that, it must be hard for corporations to cope, especially if they're long established.
It is. It is. You have to start actually focusing on doing research and development as a separate activity, whereas before a lot of companies would do it as a one-off. You actually have to have, you should have a separate team that's working on research and development and figuring out how you build products that you implement.
We gave that
in
away to
production.
the vendors, didn't we? We sort of left the vendors, your trusted partner will tell you what's the right product for you and what's the right thing to put in there. But your trusted partner is not motivated by necessarily your best interest. It might be partially motivated by its best financial interests and suggesting products that are not optimal. We sold away our R&D a long time ago, I think.
That's what we've seen for probably the past 15 years. We've advocated engineering to other companies. If you installing a router, installing an array is not engineering.
No.
I'm sorry. And I'm a CCIE myself. It's most of what I've done in my career is not engineering. Working with the different components that build these routers, build these devices, build these storage platforms, build these cloud platforms is actual engineering.
Yeah.
It's understanding fundamentally how the components interact. It is understanding how to run the development lifecycle on these components. And what's happening now, what I see happening now, and this is disruptive to a lot of IT organizations, is the requirement to implement the most innovative solutions requires that we actually learn to engineer again. And that skill set has been driven out of our industry.
And you're not following, you're creating.
Yeah.
So normally you just follow the instruction manual or the best practices guide and you get the hardening guide out to secure it. You're not doing creative work, you're just following the train tracks laid out for you.
I would also say, and I think this is an important point, and building on what both Sean and Colin have said, we see a lot of companies who want to explore open source and they participate in open source. I think one thing that's really important is if you want to do it well, you have to have buy-in from much further up the organization. We often think of open source as this groundswell that can go ground up. Ultimately, if you want it to succeed, like one thing everybody in this room knows is that the culture of a company is defined by the CEO down. And if you have a bad CEO with a bad set of attitudes towards open source, it's going to be very difficult to succeed. So a big chunk of success here is not just getting people building technology in your company.
Not just pulling out skunkworks projects and getting them started and look, I built something for free.
This romantic notion of sneaking a Linux server into your desk in 1998 is gone, right? It's about getting understanding from your executives.
So speaking of executives, one of the big parts about open source projects is that you take from the project, but implicit in that giving to you of a free product is that you're going to give back. This idea of contributing your changes or contributing the work that you've done back to the project is fundamental to the long-term continuity. And we've seen open source projects die because people take but don't contribute back. And it's becoming increasingly critical to look at open source projects in terms of who's maintaining them and what sort of longevity they're going to have, what's the value of the ecosystem, how are people contributing. And we've seen lots of big companies contribute very little back, and we've seen some big companies contribute a lot. So, for example, Facebook has been very big in contributing a lot of stuff back to open source projects. Amazon, for example, contributes very little. It's almost impossible to see what Amazon's giving back. They take, they make billions and give nothing back. Can open source projects die if that continues?
Certainly.
Yeah. Happens all the time.
But contributing back isn't easy.
You have to hire right. I mean, so the concept of DevOps, which is nothing more than the reality that every developer and every operator have to have some attributes of each of the other skill set. You can't just develop software anymore and not understand how it gets implemented, and the vice versa is true. You have to hire those people, and you have to cultivate them and have that kind of culture within your company that makes it so they can
some of the
thrive.
most successful open source projects are when you go and hire one of the people involved in the project.
Yes.
And put them inside your company for 6 months to transfer knowledge and to do something in the project for you.
But long-term success, and we've seen companies that are very good at this, is not just hiring the Ronin. So there's Ronin in our industry that they're committed to the project and they don't care whose paycheck funds that. The most successful pattern that I've seen, I think we share this view, is when those companies are committed to developing kids straight out of college, to helping engineers with 10, 20 years experience come into the project, helping them implement it, describe it, communicate about it, and then upstream from more than that one person. That's incredibly hard to do, especially from an IT operations team. It really means that you need to have an agile software development team in IT operations. You call it DevOps, but running a software development team is hard.
Look at Walmart, right? Walmart and their OneOps project. They took OpenStack and they just and then built a whole cloud orchestration platform on top of it, and then put it into the open source community. They continue to push code into it,
Right.
and as everybody else contributes to that code, guess what happens to Walmart's IT infrastructure? It just got better.
Yeah.
Yep.
More importantly, they didn't pay for it, right? So even though they're investing and they're giving this away, they're actually extracting corporate value, but it comes later. It doesn't come.
It's a deferred maintenance cost, actually. So, in my organization, it's estimated that 22% of the cost it takes to create a project is needed to maintain a project internally.
Yeah.
One of the justifications I use to our legal team and the group executive teams is that not only can we participate in healthy communities, partner with our manufacturers and our customers, but also we defer maintenance cost. It's just good business. I can have more of my developers doing good stuff that adds value to our company and the community.
And the thing there as well is we see a lot of companies who one of the worst things you can do in the open source world is a code dump. You just create something and dump it on the internet and off you go.
Publish it on GitHub.
Right? Yeah.
Call it an open source project.
If you just dump it in GitHub and have no code is the community is the main thing. Code is an artifact. So to me, companies that succeed in this world are companies not just writing code, it's the way in which they do it, it's the way in which they engage, the way in which they participate. And that determines the respect in rooms such as this, in my mind. If you look at the Linux kernel, the most respected companies are the companies not that write the most code, who engage the best.
So I think the summary or the takeaway here is that if you decide to start taking open source and bringing it into your business, start thinking about how you can contribute back, because if you want to own that product and use it for 15 to 20 years, someone's got to be putting something into it, and that's probably you. You can help. right? And I think that's really important to understand. Normally, you would pay a vendor to sustain and maintain a product over time to make sure it has longevity. But the other flip side of it is that now, if you're taking something for free, you've got to put it back, or that product might die. Well, thank you very much to my panelists today. I'd like to thank Sean Roberts. He's the Director of Technical Program Management at Walmart Labs. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Colin McNamara, Director, Cloud Trace, what is it?
It's actually Practice Director for North and South America Dimension Data.
Okay, near enough. Jono Bacon, Director of Community GitHub. I'm Greg Ferro. I'm from the Packet Pushers podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today at Interop. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.